The dim glow of the harbor streetlights reflected off the damp cobblestones of East Haven, a city on the eastern coast of the United States. Known for its bustling shipping industry, the port city thrived not just on legitimate commerce but also on the shadowy dealings of a deeply entrenched network of corrupt officials. Beneath the surface, the city was a web of deceit woven by powerful figures, politicians, detectives, and enforcers, each protecting their cut of the illicit empire. Among them, Detective Morris epitomized brutality. His square jaw and knuckles bore scars from countless fights, a testament to his readiness to use fists instead of formalities. His partner, Lieutenant Dorsey, approached their work with a veneer of intelligence and restraint. While Morris leaned into intimidation and violence, Dorsey hesitated at certain thresholds, her sharp eyes flickering with unease when things went too far. Their dynamic reflected the tension within their syndicate. "You've got to play the long game," Dorsey would warn Morris. But his smirk and gruff voice always countered. "What's the point of waiting when you can settle things with a little persuasion?" Their partnership held steady only because both understood the fragile ecosystem that kept them afloat. Federal Judge Cassandra Hayes was a name that resonated within the circles of East Haven's elite, though not for reasons they appreciated. Her judgments, grounded in an unwavering sense of justice, had drawn ire from the city's shadowy power brokers. What no one realized was that Cassandra had been quietly building a case for years, piecing together fragments of evidence from courtroom whispers, inexplicably dismissed charges, and missing files. She had first grown suspicious when a notorious gang leader walked free due to insufficient evidence. That same week, a stack of incriminating documents vanished from the courthouse. The pattern repeated itself in subtle but telling ways. An officer with a pristine record suddenly removed from duty, financial discrepancies buried in sealed accounts, and suspects released before sunrise without explanation. Cassandra saw the patterns, even when others chose to ignore them. In flashbacks, Cassandra's meticulous memory painted a vivid timeline of her investigation. She recalled a prosecutor's slip of the tongue, revealing that Morris was often too involved in cases that collapsed. She remembered the apprehension on a young officer's face when she questioned him about inconsistencies in a report, his trembling hands screaming fear. Determined to confront the corruption, Cassandra began working behind the scenes, enlisting trusted allies from the FBI. Every move was calculated. Anonymous sources provided her with key names and operations. Couriers delivered encrypted messages that unraveled layers of the criminal machine. It wasn't just about bringing them down. It was about ensuring no loophole let them escape. But as her plans gained traction, so did the danger. That evening, under the relentless downpour of East Haven's autumn rain, Cassandra found herself cornered. Emerging from the courthouse, she barely registered the van screeching to a halt until rough hands grabbed her. She fought, her nails scraping against wet leather gloves, but the strength of her attackers overpowered her. Inside the vehicle, she faced the familiar faces of Morris and Dorsey. Morris's cruel smile curved as he taunted her. "This little crusade of yours ends tonight, Judge Hayes," he sneered, his breath reeking of tobacco. Dorsey, perched stiffly in the passenger seat, avoided Cassandra's gaze, though her clenched jaw betrayed unease. "I expected more subtlety from East Haven's finest," Cassandra spat, her voice sharp despite the terror she felt. Her wrists throbbed from the tight bindings, but her mind raced faster than her heart. Morris chuckled, a dark sound that filled the confined space. "Subtlety's overrated," he said, before leaning closer. "You're about to learn that we always win. One way or another." Dorsey's shoulders tensed as she interrupted, her tone low but pointed. "Do you even know what she knows? Or are we just making this worse?" "Stop worrying," Morris snapped, waving her off. "She doesn't scare anyone with her big words and robes." Cassandra observed the exchange with sharp focus. Dorsey's reluctance and Morris's arrogance were cracks in the armor. She filed the details away, knowing that hesitation could be exploited. Rain pounded against the van's metal roof as it veered through desolate streets. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke mixed with the musty scent of damp upholstery. The driver, a younger officer whose name Cassandra had overheard in whispers, Egan, exchanged hushed words with Morris, their tone tense. Leaning her head back against the van's cold interior, Cassandra fought to calm her breathing. Externally, she remained composed, but her thoughts were electric. She had been taught in law school that justice required strategy, patience, and timing. Tonight, her survival depended on those same principles. Through the murmur of voices, Cassandra caught Dorsey's whisper, "We're already pushing it. If this backfires..." Morris cut her off, his voice dismissive. "No one's coming for her. We control the city." Cassandra bit back a retort, choosing silence over confrontation. Morris's overconfidence would serve her purpose. Her mind churned with possibilities. If she could turn Dorsey's hesitation into doubt, if she could make Egan question his loyalty, perhaps, just perhaps, she could shift the power dynamic enough to escape. As the van pulled into a decrepit warehouse at the edge of the industrial district, Cassandra braced herself for what awaited. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers ceased, replaced by the shrill creak of the van doors. The frigid rain stung her face as they dragged her out, and for a fleeting moment, she locked eyes with Dorsey. "Whatever you're doing, it won't work," Cassandra said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You might kill me, but you'll never erase what I've uncovered." Dorsey faltered, but Morris shoved Cassandra forward, barking orders at the other officers to secure the building. The rain mingled with the metallic taste of fear in Cassandra's mouth. But beneath her outward calm, a fire burned. If her captors thought they could silence her, they had gravely underestimated the resilience of a woman who had stared down corruption for years. And as she stepped into the dim, foreboding interior of the warehouse, Cassandra vowed that this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of their downfall. The warehouse loomed like a concrete tomb, its towering walls lined with rusted metal shelves and stained with decades of neglect. A single flickering bulb illuminated the center of the room, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Cassandra Hayes was dragged inside, her shoes scraping against the damp floor. The cold metallic air stung her nostrils as her captors shoved her into a steel chair, the legs scraping noisily against the cement. Detective Morris loomed over her, his towering frame silhouetted by the sputtering light. His lips curled into a sneer as he yanked the ropes tighter around her wrists, ensuring no room for maneuver. "Comfortable, Your Honor?" he asked mockingly, his voice dripping with malice. Cassandra ignored him, her sharp eyes scanning the room for details. Each officer stationed around the warehouse looked nervous, their movements betraying unease. Her gaze landed on Lieutenant Dorsey, standing a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Dorsey's expression was tense, her focus darting between Cassandra and Morris like a spectator unsure of which side to back. Morris leaned in close, the stench of stale tobacco and sweat wafting from him. "Here's the deal, Judge," he growled. "You're going to tell us everything you've got. Names, files, plans, and maybe we let you walk out of here in one piece." Cassandra smirked despite the rope biting into her wrists. "Let me guess," she said evenly. "You'll stop at nothing to protect your little empire of bribes and dirty money? You've already gone too far, Detective. Whatever you think you'll gain, it won't save you." Morris's face darkened, and in a blur of motion, he slammed his fist against the chair's armrest, the clang echoing through the cavernous room. Cassandra flinched but refused to look away. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Morris snarled. "But you're in my city now." Before he could say more, Dorsey intervened. "Enough," she snapped, stepping between them. "We need to be smart about this. If we push too hard, we're the ones who'll get burned." The tension between the two was palpable, their clashing styles of control creating an invisible fissure that Cassandra observed keenly. She knew she had no friends in this room, but Dorsey's hesitation was a potential weapon, a crack she could widen. Cassandra's voice broke the silence, calm but piercing. "What's the matter, Lieutenant?" she asked, her words a scalpel slicing through the room. "Worried this will all come crashing down? I don't blame you. When it does, people like you get buried first." Morris scoffed, his hand twitching as if itching to strike her, but Dorsey cut him off again. "She's bluffing," Dorsey said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Cassandra retorted, leaning forward as much as her bindings allowed. "You're all underestimating me. Every name, every deal, every dirty cop in this rotten system, it's all been documented. My allies know exactly where I am, and they won't stop until they bring this place down." Dorsey's jaw tightened, but Morris erupted into laughter. "She's fishing for a reaction," he said, gesturing to the others. "Don't fall for it. This honorable judge isn't as clever as she thinks." But Cassandra wasn't fishing, she was laying traps. She noticed the younger officer, Egan, shifting uneasily near the door. His hands hovered close to his belt, where his firearm rested, but his expression betrayed inexperience. She would remember him. As the room dissolved into muttered debates among the officers, Cassandra subtly pressed her shoulder against her lapel. A tiny click confirmed that the embedded signal device had activated. It was a desperate measure she had hoped to avoid, but the situation left no other choice. Somewhere, an undercover FBI agent would be receiving her location. It wasn't much, but it was a thread of hope. Minutes turned to hours. Cassandra was subjected to a barrage of accusations and threats, each one more desperate than the last. Morris's patience wore thin, his violent impulses barely contained. He punched a nearby pillar, sending a resonating crack through the air, and barked orders at the others to ensure the perimeter was secure. "Let me guess," Cassandra said, her voice breaking the tense silence. "The plan is to intimidate me until I break? Or maybe you're hoping someone else will handle the cleanup when this all falls apart?" Morris glared at her, but Dorsey spoke first. "Shut up," she said, though her tone lacked the venom of her partner. Cassandra tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Do you really think this will stay quiet? People are already asking questions. If I disappear, do you think that won't raise alarms? You know how this ends." "You don't know anything," Morris growled, but his words carried a hint of unease. Cassandra leaned back, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't I? You've already lost control. Look at them." She gestured toward the other officers, each avoiding her gaze. "They're wondering if you'll sell them out to save yourself. How long before they turn on you?" The room erupted into muttered arguments, and Cassandra silently memorized every interaction. Names were dropped in whispered accusations, alliances frayed under the weight of paranoia. And then there was Dorsey. Her hesitation grew with each passing moment, her silence speaking louder than Morris's threats. "You'll regret this," Cassandra said finally, her voice steady and deliberate. "All of you." But as the storm of egos and fear brewed around her, Cassandra remained laser-focused. The FBI was coming, and with every passing second, the fragile foundation of this corrupt empire continued to crack. It was only a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed, and Cassandra Hayes would make sure she was the one standing amidst the rubble. The warehouse was still except for the distant hum of the city, muffled by the walls. Time dragged on, but Cassandra Hayes remained vigilant, her mind sharp despite the cold seeping into her bones. Her wrists ached from the bindings, and the metallic taste of desperation lingered on her tongue. Yet, her resolve was unshaken. Every passing minute brought her closer to either rescue or her own destruction. She watched carefully as Morris paced like a predator, barking orders at the officers guarding the perimeter. "No one comes in or out without my say, so," he growled, his frustration apparent. His confidence from earlier was starting to crack, replaced by an underlying tension that even he couldn't hide. Lieutenant Dorsey, meanwhile, stood near the edge of the room, fiddling with a cigarette she never lit. Her eyes darted from Morris to Cassandra, her posture betraying a storm of thoughts she couldn't silence. Cassandra seized on that, knowing Dorsey's hesitation might soon tip the scales. Cassandra's survival depended on extracting as much information as she could. She listened intently, her ears attuned to every murmured word and argument. Over the next hours, snippets of conversation revealed what she had suspected but needed confirmed. "They're too close," muttered one of the guards to another. Morris overheard and snapped, "Shut up. If you stick to the plan, no one will find us." The guard scoffed but obeyed, though the unease in his voice lingered. "We've been here too long. They're bound to catch up eventually." Cassandra internalized every detail. Their fear of being discovered was palpable, but their loyalty to Morris was tenuous. She silently began piecing together a map of their operation, names mentioned in passing, routes used for contraband, and the unspoken alliances that bound them all. Hours later, the air thickened as Morris's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to take the call, his voice lowered but still audible enough for Cassandra to catch fragments. "The shipment. I don't care. Stall them. No, she's not leaving here alive until I say so." When Morris returned, Cassandra couldn't resist a barb. "Trouble keeping the wheels of corruption turning, detective?" His glare was like daggers, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured to Dorsey. "We need to search her for anything she might have hidden." "She's too calm." Dorsey hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We already checked her. She's got nothing." "Check her again," Morris insisted, stepping forward. But Cassandra interrupted before he could touch her. "You're wasting time," she said sharply. "You don't need to search me again. I already told you, you've lost. You just don't see it yet." Her voice was calm, but her heart pounded as she discreetly pressed her shoulder against the lapel once more, ensuring the signal continued to transmit. If the FBI had received it, they were closer now. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. One of the guards burst in, his face pale. "Morris, we've got a problem. There's movement outside, unmarked cars." Morris's jaw tightened as he exchanged a glance with Dorsey. "You're imagining things," he barked, though his tone betrayed him. "I'm not," the guard insisted. "I saw them. They're circling." Morris turned to the rest of the group, barking orders to secure the exits and double the watch. Cassandra hid a flicker of satisfaction, knowing the pressure was mounting. She decided to stoke the fire further. "You feel it, don't you?" she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "The wall's closing in. Your little kingdom is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." "Shut up!" Morris roared, his composure slipping. Cassandra smiled faintly. "You might silence me, but you can't stop the truth." Morris lunged at her, grabbing the back of the chair and yanking it forward. "Do you want to die tonight, Judge Hayes?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "That's the difference between you and me," Cassandra said, unflinching. "I'm willing to die for what's right." "Are you?" For a moment, the room was silent except for the distant thrum of the city. Dorsey finally intervened, pulling Morris back. "Enough," she snapped. "This isn't solving anything." Morris glared at her, but Dorsey held her ground. "If they're out there," she said, her voice low, "we need to think this through. We can't shoot our way out of this." "They're not out there," Morris shouted, though the doubt in his voice was clear. Cassandra capitalized on the growing discord. "She's right, detective," she said. "You're outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The best you can hope for is to turn on each other before they break down the door." "You don't know what you're talking about." Morris snapped, but his outburst only underscored her point. The arguments among the group escalated, and Cassandra's mind raced with plans. She needed them distracted long enough for the FBI to close in. Suddenly, she noticed an opportunity. Morris had carelessly dropped his phone on a nearby table. If she could reach it... "Dorsey," Cassandra called out, her tone measured. The lieutenant glanced at her, wary. "You don't have to go down with him," Cassandra said softly. "You still have a choice." Dorsey's eyes flickered with something: indecision, guilt, or perhaps fear. Before she could respond, Morris stormed over and silenced Cassandra with a harsh shove of her chair. But Cassandra had bought herself a few precious seconds. Her fingers found the edge of the phone, and she managed to tilt it closer with a subtle movement. The chaos in the room grew louder as officers argued about the supposed unmarked cars outside. Tensions reached a boiling point, and Cassandra could sense the thin threads of loyalty unraveling. As the first rays of dawn seeped through the grimy windows, Cassandra felt the tide shifting. She gritted her teeth against the pain in her wrists, holding on to the hope that the endgame was near. The cracks in Morris's control were growing wider. Soon, they would break entirely, and when they did, Cassandra would ensure the house of cards came crashing down. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension, every creak of the walls and shift of the guards amplifying the unease. Morris's anger was a volatile force, radiating out to the officers who shuffled nervously, their eyes darting toward the exits. Cassandra Hayes remained still in her chair, her wrists raw from the ropes and her body fatigued, but her mind was sharp. She had seen this unraveling before, not in life-and-death scenarios but in courtroom battles where the guilty scrambled to protect their fragile alliances. Across the room, faint sounds began to surface, murmurs, footsteps on wet pavement, and distant vehicle engines humming in unison. Something was out there, and the captors knew it. One of the younger officers, Egan, stepped away from his post near the door, visibly shaken. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming for her. This is going to blow up in our faces." Morris rounded on him like a wolf. "If you want to run, go ahead, Egan. But if you cross me, you'll be crawling out of here on broken legs." Egan flinched, his hand instinctively brushing against his holstered weapon, though he lacked the courage to draw it. Morris's intimidation held, for now. Lieutenant Dorsey, however, stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. The weight of Cassandra's words lingered with her, each one a seed of doubt growing into unease. She glared at Morris. "Enough threats," she snapped. "We need a plan, and scaring the rookies isn't it." The cracks in their unity widened. Cassandra noticed how Egan lingered closer to the edge of the room, glancing at the nearest exit. The other officers exchanged uneasy looks, whispering in corners, their confidence unraveling as paranoia crept in. Through it all, Cassandra stayed silent, watching. When Dorsey caught her gaze, the judge spoke quietly but firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You know they won't protect you," Cassandra said. "When this falls apart, Morris will make sure you take the blame. He's setting you up." "Don't listen to her," Morris barked, but even he couldn't mask his frustration. Dorsey didn't reply, but the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed that the words had landed. Amid the growing tension, Cassandra heard something faint but unmistakable, a muffled cry. It came from somewhere beyond the immediate room. She tilted her head slightly, straining to listen. It happened again, a soft, desperate sound, like someone trying to suppress their fear. "Who else is here?" Cassandra asked, her voice steady but probing. Morris glared at her, but Dorsey's expression flickered with alarm. Cassandra seized on the reaction. "You have other prisoners?" "Shut up," Morris growled, stepping toward her, but Cassandra didn't back down. "You're holding more people," she continued, louder now, directing her words to the rest of the group. "How many? Do they know? Are you risking all of their lives too?" Her words hung in the air, and the weight of them pulled at the room's fragile balance. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Dorsey's lips parted as if she were about to speak but stopped herself. Morris, however, exploded. "You don't know anything, Judge," he snapped, grabbing Cassandra's chair and dragging it closer to the center of the room. The screech of metal echoed off the walls. "You think you're so smart, trying to pit us against each other? I'll show you what happens when you push too far." The younger officers recoiled at Morris's outburst, and Dorsey stepped forward. "That's enough," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "You don't get to tell me what's enough," Morris shot back, his face contorted with rage. While they argued, Cassandra turned her focus inward. Her hands, though bound, weren't idle. She felt the rope's fibers loosening just enough from her subtle movements over the past hours. Every second they spent arguing was another chance for her to free herself, and she wasn't going to waste it. In the background, the muffled cry came again, louder this time. Cassandra looked toward the sound and then turned her attention back to Dorsey. "You're in over your head," she said firmly. "You have a chance to stop this. Do you really want blood on your hands?" Dorsey hesitated, and for the first time, Morris noticed. "You're not seriously listening to her, are you?" he spat, his eyes narrowing. "She's stalling," Dorsey replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Cassandra pressed on. "Whatever they're promising you, it's not worth it. You can still do the right thing." A sudden loud noise broke the moment, a heavy thud against the warehouse's exterior. The group froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. A second thud followed, then a distant shout. "They're here," one of the guards muttered, panic lacing his voice. "Hold your positions." Morris barked, pulling his gun and gesturing for the others to do the same. The room erupted into frantic movement as the officers scrambled to lock doors and barricade entrances. Dorsey remained still, her eyes fixed on Cassandra. As the chaos unfolded, Cassandra felt the last of the rope's fibers give way. Her hands were free. She kept them hidden, maintaining the illusion of restraint, but her mind raced with possibilities. A loud crash came from the warehouse's south side, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the space. Morris shouted orders, his voice barely cutting through the cacophony of panic. Dorsey stepped toward Cassandra, her gun drawn but not aimed. "Don't do anything stupid," she said, her voice low. Cassandra met her gaze. "That depends on you," she replied. Before Dorsey could respond, the lights flickered, and a deafening bang filled the air. Smoke billowed into the room as flashbangs detonated, disorienting everyone. Cassandra seized her chance. She launched herself from the chair, grabbing the phone Morris had left on the table. Her legs wobbled, unsteady from hours of confinement, but adrenaline surged through her veins. "Stop her!" Morris shouted, his voice muffled by the chaos. Cassandra sprinted toward the nearest corner, weaving through the confusion. Dorsey hesitated, her gun shaking as she aimed but didn't fire. Through the smoke, Cassandra saw shadows moving, figures clad in tactical gear. The FBI had arrived. As gunfire erupted and officers clashed, Cassandra ducked behind a stack of crates, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Her pulse thundered, but for the first time, hope burned bright. The storm had arrived, and Cassandra knew it was only a matter of time before justice reclaimed the night. The first volley of gunfire shattered the warehouse's oppressive silence, ricocheting off the metal walls and filling the air with chaos. Smoke grenades hissed as they filled the room with a dense, choking fog, reducing visibility to mere shadows. Flashes of light from muzzle fire illuminated the frantic faces of the corrupt officers. Cassandra Hayes crouched behind a stack of crates, her breaths sharp and shallow. She clutched the phone she'd snatched earlier, her fingers trembling but steadying as her mind focused. The cacophony of shouts and gunfire was deafening, yet she tuned into it with the precision of a judge weighing testimony. Each shot and scream painted a picture of the battlefield unfolding around her. Morris roared commands, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold your ground. Don't let them take this place." His desperation bled into his words, and Cassandra recognized it for what it was, a man clinging to a crumbling empire. Lieutenant Dorsey was less vocal, her movements calculated. Cassandra glimpsed her shadow moving between pillars, her gun drawn but not yet firing. The lieutenant's hesitation persisted, and Cassandra knew it could be turned into an advantage. A loud crash from the far end of the warehouse announced the FBI's tactical entry. Armed agents in full gear poured in, their coordinated movements a stark contrast to the chaotic scrambling of Morris's men. The shouts of "Federal agents! Drop your weapons!" echoed through the room, but few obeyed. Cassandra seized the moment. She activated the phone's flashlight and waved it briefly above her hiding spot, a silent signal to the agents. A burst of gunfire followed, sending bullets tearing into the crates she hid behind, forcing her to drop and crawl to a safer position. As she moved, she heard a distinct cry of pain followed by a thud. Someone had been taken down. Every step closer to the exits heightened her urgency, but her path was blocked by a firefight raging between Morris and the advancing agents. Morris, a hulking figure of brute force, fought with reckless abandon. He emptied his weapon at the agents, reloading with practiced speed, his growls of defiance audible even over the chaos. "You want me? Come and get me," he bellowed, his voice raw with fury. One of the FBI agents, quick and precise, managed to flank Morris. A swift tackle brought him down, but not without a brutal struggle. Morris swung wildly, landing a heavy blow to the agent's jaw before they subdued him with a disorienting jab to his ribs. Meanwhile, Cassandra found herself face to face with another officer, Egan. His gun wavered as he aimed at her, his youthful face pale with indecision. "Don't do this," Cassandra urged, her voice firm yet empathetic. "You're better than this." Egan hesitated, his hands shaking. I didn't sign up for this," he muttered, his gun lowering slightly. Before he could decide, an FBI agent emerged from the smoke and disarmed him with a swift move, sending Egan sprawling to the ground. Cassandra felt a pang of relief but pressed on, weaving through the maze of crates and pillars. She finally reached the section where the muffled cries had originated earlier. Kicking open a poorly latched door, she found two prisoners huddled in a corner, a young man and an older woman. Both looked battered but alive. "We're getting out of here," Cassandra said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She quickly untied their bindings, her fingers working deftly as the battle outside continued. The young man, trembling, stammered, They said they'd kill us if we made a sound." "They won't get the chance," Cassandra assured him. "Stay low and follow me." Guiding the two toward the nearest exit, Cassandra felt a swell of hope as the sound of gunfire began to wane. The FBI was gaining control. She peered out of the doorway and saw a clear path to safety. "Go," she whispered, ushering the two prisoners out. "Don't stop until you see the agents." They nodded and darted into the smoke-filled chaos, their silhouettes vanishing quickly. Cassandra turned back, her instincts compelling her to ensure no one else was left behind. In the center of the warehouse, Morris had been subdued but not silenced. "You think this is over?" he spat, blood dripping from a cut on his brow. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Dorsey stood nearby, her weapon lowered, her face etched with conflict. Cassandra approached cautiously, stepping into her line of sight. "It is over," Cassandra said, her voice calm but commanding. "You don't have to go down with him, Lieutenant." Dorsey's hand twitched, her grip on the gun loosening. I didn't want this," she murmured. "You still have a choice," Cassandra pressed, stepping closer. "Help me make this right." For a moment, the tension hung thick between them. Then, with a resigned sigh, Dorsey tossed her gun to the ground. "I'm done," she said quietly. At that moment, the lead FBI agent approached, his voice authoritative. "Hands up. Step away from her." Cassandra raised her hand slowly, nodding toward Dorsey. "She's surrendering. Let her explain herself." The agent cuffed Dorsey, who didn't resist, and motioned for another team to take custody of Morris. The once dominant detective was dragged out, shouting threats and curses that echoed into the night. As the chaos settled, Cassandra finally allowed herself to breathe. The warehouse was secure, the corrupt network dismantled in one decisive strike. Exhausted but unbroken, she stepped into the cool night air, her thoughts already turning to the next battle, the courtroom. Justice had been delayed for too long, but now it was finally within reach. The courtroom was electric with anticipation, its grand oak doors flanked by a wall of reporters wielding cameras and microphones. The trial of Detective Morris, Lieutenant Dorsey, and their network of corrupt officers had become a nationwide spectacle. Federal Judge Cassandra Hayes, though slightly bruised from her ordeal, presided over the packed courtroom with a calm authority that demanded respect. The defendants sat at the defense table, their appearances a stark contrast to their former selves. Morris's once intimidating presence was diminished. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. Dorsey, subdued and pale, sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Around them sat other disgraced officers, their expressions ranging from defiant to defeated. Cassandra began the proceedings with a crisp rap of the gavel. "This court is now in session." The charges against these defendants include conspiracy, corruption, extortion, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. We will hear evidence presented by the prosecution. The lead prosecutor stood, her confidence evident as she opened the case. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we will expose the full extent of a criminal enterprise that infiltrated the very institutions meant to protect and serve. We have irrefutable evidence, recordings, financial records, and testimony from victims." Cassandra's unwavering gaze moved to the jury as the prosecution laid out their case. The FBI's intervention at the warehouse had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Documents, encrypted messages, and ledgers had tied Morris and his co-conspirators to years of criminal activity. The prosecution's first witness was an FBI agent who had led the tactical raid. Clad in his crisp uniform, he recounted the events of that fateful night. "When we breached the warehouse," he testified, "we found the defendants actively engaged in attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate their prisoner, Judge Hayes. Their resistance only underscored their guilt." Morris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his attorney whispering furiously in his ear. The next witness was one of the victims Cassandra had freed from the warehouse. A young man named Carlos took the stand, his voice shaking but resolute. "They kept me there for days," he said. "They threatened me because I saw them planting drugs on innocent people. I thought I'd never get out alive." The room fell silent as Carlos detailed the abuses he endured. Every word deepened the weight of the charges against the defendants. When Cassandra called Dorsey to the stand, the tension in the room peaked. There had been speculation about whether the lieutenant would cooperate with the prosecution. As she walked to the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with Morris, the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Dorsey sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden railing. "Lieutenant Dorsey," the prosecutor began, "you were part of this operation for years. Why did you stay silent?" Dorsey hesitated, her lips pressed together. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "At first, I thought I could manage it. Keep things in check. But it got out of control. People like Morris, they don't stop. And I was too scared to stop them." "Scared of what?" the prosecutor pressed. "Of ending up like the people we silenced," Dorsey admitted, her voice cracking. "But Judge Hayes, she said something that stuck with me. She said it's never too late to do the right thing. That's why I surrendered." Morris slammed his fist on the table, drawing a sharp rebuke from his attorney. Cassandra rapped the gavel. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice firm. The prosecutor nodded at Dorsey. "And now, you've chosen to cooperate. Can you tell the court what you witnessed?" Dorsey detailed the operations, the bribes, the falsified evidence, and the systematic silencing of anyone who got in their way. Every revelation painted Morris as the ringleader, and her testimony corroborated the physical evidence the FBI had uncovered. When the prosecution presented the recordings Cassandra had gathered during her captivity, the courtroom was transfixed. The audio of Morris and his team's threats filled the air, leaving no room for doubt about their intentions. In her closing statement, the prosecutor delivered a scathing indictment. The defendants betrayed their badges, their community, and the very ideals of justice. It is up to you, the jury, to ensure that such betrayal does not go unanswered. The defense attorneys tried to counter, casting doubt on the prosecution's witnesses and implying that Cassandra's actions at the warehouse had been reckless. But their arguments faltered under the sheer weight of the evidence. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Cassandra's voice resonated through the courtroom as she read the decision. On the charge of conspiracy to commit corruption, the jury finds the defendants guilty. On the charge of extortion, guilty. On the charges of false imprisonment and attempted murder, guilty. Morris's face contorted in rage, but he said nothing as the bailiffs approached. Dorsey lowered her head, silent tears streaming down her face. In the days that followed, the trial became a symbol of accountability. News outlets hailed Cassandra as a beacon of justice, her courage in the face of danger inspiring countless others. On the courthouse steps, a crowd of supporters had gathered. Cassandra, exhausted but triumphant, emerged to a wave of applause. She addressed the media briefly, her words measured and powerful. "This is not just about holding a few individuals accountable," she said. "It's about restoring faith in our institutions. Justice is not easy, but it is necessary. And we must never stop fighting for it." As she descended the steps, a young woman approached, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Judge Hayes," she said softly. "You saved my brother." Cassandra nodded, her heart swelling with purpose. She had endured the worst of humanity and emerged victorious, not for herself, but for those who needed justice most. In the weeks that followed, the remnants of Morris's operation were dismantled, and reforms swept through East Haven's law enforcement. Cassandra returned to her courtroom, her resolve stronger than ever. The fight for justice was never truly over, but for Cassandra Hayes, every battle won was a step closer to the world she believed in, a world where truth and courage could prevail. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.